The laughter hit her like a physical thing. Abigail Keller had heard Ira Weston's voice carry across the supper table 100 times in the 11 months she had been on the Copper Ridge Ranch. She had heard him bark orders at the hands, heard him grunt approval over a well-mended fence line, heard him murmur soft words to a colicking mare in the blue hour before dawn, when he did not know anyone else was awake. But she had never, not once in all those months of careful observation, heard him laugh. Not like this. It started low, a rumbling disbelief in his chest, the kind of sound a man makes when something catches him so completely off guard that his body does not know what to do with it. Then it broke open. It cracked through the heavy silence of the ranch house dining room like a rifle shot, and every one of the 4 ranch hands seated at the long table froze with their spoons halfway to their mouths. Old Pete dropped his biscuit into his beans. Young Denny Marsh turned red as a summer beet because he thought somehow the joke was on him. And Ira Weston, 6 feet and 2 inches of granite-shouldered, iron-jawed, grief-carved cattle rancher, put his face down into his hands and shook with it. Abigail sat very still at the opposite end of the table and watched him. She had not meant to say it. The observation had simply arrived on her tongue the way honest things sometimes did, quick and clean and slightly impolite, and she had released it without thinking. But now, the man who had not laughed since God only knew when was laughing so hard his broad shoulders heaved, and something inside Abigail's chest was doing something it had absolutely no business doing. She pressed her lips together and looked down at her plate and told herself it meant nothing. She was wrong. It had begun, as so many things in the autumn of 1882 began, with necessity. Abigail Keller had ridden into the town of Ridgecross, New Mexico Territory on a Wednesday morning in October of that year, aboard a mule she had traded 2 weeks of surveying labor to obtain. She was 26 years old, possessed a surveyor's license issued by the territorial government that most men in Ridgecross refused to believe was genuine, and she had exactly $4.30 in the pocket of her canvas work trousers. She was not, as several of the men on the main street seemed to assume when they looked at her sun-darkened face and the leather instrument case strapped across her back, passing through. She was looking for work. Ridgecross in the fall of 1882 was a town caught in the particular kind of tension that existed all across the New Mexico Territory in those years. The cattle barons were pushing north and west. The homesteaders were filing land claims as fast as the territorial offices could process the paperwork, and the railroads were sending their own survey crews out ahead of the iron to map routes through land that 3 different parties all believed they owned. Disputes were common. Violence, when the disputes went unresolved long enough, was not uncommon. And legitimate professional surveyors, the kind who carried a girly transit and knew how to run a proper meets and bounds description in accordance with the general land office standards, were in short supply. Abigail Keller was exceptionally good at her work. She had learned the trade from her father, a meticulous Massachusetts-born civil engineer who had moved the family to Santa Fe when Abigail was 9 years old and promptly set about teaching her everything he knew, because she was the only one of his 4 children who showed any aptitude for mathematics. By the time she was 15, she could operate a transit, a plane table, and a compass with equal precision. By the time she was 20, she had assisted in the official survey of 3 county boundaries in the territory. By the time her father died of pneumonia in the winter of 1879, she had taken over his small contracting business and run it with enough competence that the Territorial Surveyor General's office had, after considerable reluctance, renewed her license in her own name. Then the business went wrong, not through any fault of her own surveying. The work was always accurate. The problem was a partner she had trusted, a man named Calhoun Briggs, who had convinced her that expanding operations into the Mora Valley would double their contracts within a year. Briggs had taken her savings, her equipment loans, and her hard-built reputation with the Santa Fe banking community, and he had vanished in the spring of 1882, leaving behind a stack of forged invoices and a debt she could not pay. The equipment she had left was what she could carry on her back. The clients she had left were the ones Briggs had not already poisoned against her with his elaborate fiction that she was incompetent, hysterical, and dangerous to work with. She had spent 6 months clawing back enough work to survive, and then she had followed a rumor south to Ridgecross about a cattle rancher who needed a survey done badly enough that he might actually hire a woman to do it. The rumor had a name attached to it, Ira Weston. The first person she asked about him in Ridgecross was the woman behind the counter at the dry goods store, a broad-faced German immigrant named Mrs. Hoffman who looked at Abigail's instrument case with frank curiosity and answered without any of the evasive awkwardness Abigail had learned to expect from strangers. "He is a good man," Mrs. Hoffman said. "Hard since he lost his wife, but fair." "How long ago did he lose her?" Abigail asked. 3 seasons now," Mrs. Hoffman said. "Maybe 4. She paused and turned back to her account ledger. "He does not speak of it." Abigail thanked her and walked back out into the dry October wind. She found the Copper Ridge Ranch by following the road north out of town for 7 miles, until the fence line changed from post-end wire to something older and more substantial. Hand-hewn cedar posts, sunk deep and strung with heavy gauge wire, in a pattern that spoke of someone who intended to stay. The ranch house sat at the base of a long, shallow ridge that gave the property its name, a solid adobe structure with a wide porch and a separate cookhouse, and a barn that was considerably better maintained than most barns she had seen in the territory. There were cattle visible on the slope above the ridge, a good-sized herd, and the pastures were in decent condition for late fall. She tied her mule at the post outside the barn and walked toward the house. Ira Weston came around the corner of the barn before she reached the porch. He nearly walked into her. He stopped fast, registered surprise, then looked at the instrument case on her back with the particular narrow expression of a man arranging information into categories he was not certain about. He was bigger than she had expected. Not simply tall, though he was that, but built with the kind of dense, functional mass that comes from 20 years of physical work rather than any particular effort at it. His hair was dark brown going to gray at the temples. His face was deeply weathered, all hard planes and long lines, the face of a man who spent most of his life in the sun and wind and had stopped thinking about it sometime in his 30s. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his late 30s, perhaps 40 at the outside. His eyes, when he finally stopped assessing the instrument case and looked at her directly, were a dark gray-green that reminded her of the color of sage after rain. He said nothing for a moment. "I am looking for Ira Weston," Abigail said. "I understand he is in need of a survey." He looked at her for another beat. "That would be me," he said. His voice was exactly what she had expected from the rest of him. Low, measured, economical. "I am Abigail Keller. I hold a license from the Territorial Surveyor General's office. I have 8 years of field experience in New Mexico Territory. I understand you have a boundary dispute with the Hadley operation to the east." Something shifted in his face. Not quite skepticism, but a cousin of it. "The Territorial office sent a woman," he said. "The Territorial office did not send me," Abigail said. "I heard you at work. I came." He studied her for another moment. Then he said, "Come inside. I will put coffee on." That had been the beginning of it. The dispute with Hadley was not simple. Abigail understood this within 20 minutes of examining the documents Ira spread across the kitchen table. Fletcher Hadley was a large-scale cattle operator who had moved into the territory from Texas 3 years prior with enough money and enough hired men to make his intentions clear. He intended to expand, and he was not particularly careful about the legal distinction between land he had purchased and land that adjoined it. The fence lines he had put up along the eastern edge of his property, which happened to be the western edge of what he claimed was open range, had been encroaching on Copper Ridge land for 2 seasons. Ira Weston had documentation going back to the original territorial patent on his land, But the document was imprecise in the way that early territorial land descriptions often were, relying on natural landmarks that had shifted or disappeared, and on survey measurements that had been done quickly and not particularly carefully in the land rush years of the 1860s. What Ira needed was a precise modern survey that would establish his eastern boundary with enough legal exactitude that it would hold up to challenge in the territorial court. What Hadley would do, once that survey was completed and filed, was Abigail's concern but not her legal problem. "I can do this," Abigail told him. He looked at her across the table. He had given her the coffee as promised, and it was strong and good, and she had decided she respected him for that at least. "How long?" he said. 2 weeks for the field work," she said. "Another week to draft the plat and the legal description. If you have a good chain man I can use, I can cut that down some. The man I trust to hold a rod straight is occupied with the cattle right now," he said. "Then I will set my own stakes," she said. "It will just take longer." He looked at the instrument case again. He had not yet asked her to prove what she claimed. She was not sure whether that was confidence or indifference, and she was not sure which she preferred. "What are your terms?" he said. She told him. He did not flinch at the price, which surprised her slightly. He countered, which did not. They settled on a figure that was fair to both of them, with half paid in advance and the remainder on delivery of the completed plat. "There is a room in the bunkhouse," he said. "I will let the hands know you will be staying on while the work is done." She had expected more argument. She had prepared for it. She had her counter-arguments arranged in order of persuasiveness, starting with the practical ones about the inefficiency of riding 7 miles each way from Ridgecross every day, and ending with the legal ones about her professional standing. She had not needed any of them. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Supper is at 6. Everyone eats together." She had come prepared to work and to leave. She had not come prepared for what Copper Ridge actually was. The ranch hand bunkhouse was clean and well organized. The 4 men who slept there were, she discovered over the first several days, neither hostile nor particularly welcoming toward her presence, simply cautious in the way that people in the territory were generally cautious about things they had not encountered before. Old Pete Garza, the eldest of them at around 50, a small, wiry man of Mexican heritage who had been on the ranch since before Ira's time, was the first to simply accept her. He asked her, on her second morning there, if she wanted to see where the old survey stakes were that had been put in back in 1864, and when she said yes, he took her out to the eastern fence line on a cold morning and showed her without any further commentary. Denny Marsh was 23 and from Missouri and tried too hard for the first week, and then settled into something more natural. The other 2 hands, brothers named Cal and Frank Reese from somewhere in West Texas, watched her for 2 days and then went back to their work and treated her with the same blunt, functional courtesy they treated each other, which she found entirely satisfactory. And Ira Weston. She saw him every morning when she went out before dawn to set up her transit. He was always already up, always already in the barn or the pasture, moving through the pre-dawn dark with the particular assurance of a man on his own land. He never spoke much during those early hours, and she did not require him to. But she became aware, gradually, that he watched her work with a quality of attention that was different from the ranch hand's casual curiosity. It was more careful, more interested. She said nothing about it and focused on the survey. The eastern boundary of Copper Ridge, she found within the first 3 days, was considerably more complicated than Ira's documents had suggested. The original 1864 survey had used a creek bend as a corner monument, and the creek had since shifted its course after a flood, leaving the actual legal corner sitting 50 yards from the current water. Hadley's fence line, meanwhile, was running on the assumption that the current creek bed was the boundary, which would give him approximately 400 acres of Copper Ridge grazing land that was legally Ira Weston's. It was not an innocent mistake. The shift in the creek was recent enough and documented enough through the county records that Hadley's surveyors, if he had used competent ones, would have known about it. It was, in Abigail's professional assessment, deliberate fraud. She spent 3 days running the traverse across the disputed ground, setting her instrument up at each successive station, shooting angles and distances with the girly transit she had managed to keep through Briggs's betrayal, because she had locked it in a separate case under her own name. The transit was the best thing she owned, and the thing she was most careful with in the world. She leveled it on its tripod with the automatic precision of someone who has done the motion 10,000 times, read the verniers, booked the angles, and moved on with a speed and accuracy that she knew was exceptional even by professional standards. On the 4th day, Ira came out to where she was working. She was set up on a ridge above the old creek bend, reading a backsight to the stake she had set the previous afternoon. She was aware of him coming before she saw him, the sound of his horse on the dry ground, but she did not lift her eye from the transit until she had booked the angle. Then she straightened and looked at him. He had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance from the instrument, which she noted. Most men who came to look at what she was doing stood too close and had to be asked to move. "How is it going?" he said. She told him what she had found about the creek. She watched his face as she explained it. The jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He said nothing for a moment and then said, quietly, "I thought it was deliberate." "I believe you were right," she said. He looked east toward where Hadley's fence line was visible as a dark thread across the pale winter grass. "How solid will your survey be in court?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Ira," she said, using his name for the first time. "This is the most accurate survey that has been done on this parcel in 20 years. Every angle will be booked to the nearest 30 seconds of arc. Every distance will be measured twice, forward and back. The legal description will be written so that any licensed surveyor in the territory who runs it will arrive at the same corners I do. Will be solid." He looked at her. Something moved in those gray-green eyes that she could not quite read. "All right," he said. He remounted and rode back toward the ranch house. She watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then looked back through her transit. The supper table at Copper Ridge was the social center of the ranch in a way that surprised her. Mrs. Hoffman in town had been right that Ira ran a fair operation, and part of that fairness was that he ate with his hands every evening. He was not a chatty man at supper, but neither was he cold. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that were specific rather than general, questions that showed he had been paying attention to whatever the person across from him was doing that day. When old Pete mentioned that one of the younger steers had been favoring his left foreleg, Ira asked which steer, where in the pasture it had been standing, and whether the limp was in the step or the landing. When Denny talked about the section of fence that needed resetting along the north line, Ira asked which posts and what the ground was like at their base. He was, Abigail thought, a man who thought carefully before he acted. He simply did not advertise the thinking. She was quiet at those first suppers. She observed. She ate well, because whoever did the cooking at Copper Ridge, which she eventually discovered was Ira himself with occasional assistance from whoever was least exhausted, cooked without apology and with considerable competence. There was always meat and beans and cornbread and something else, dried apple pie or pickled vegetables from the root cellar or a pot of postle that old Pete made on Sundays. On the 8th day of her work on the ranch, Denny Marsh knocked on the bunkhouse door after supper and, with enormous self-consciousness, asked if she would look at a letter he was trying to write to a girl in Ridgecross. She looked at it. She rewrote most of it without telling him that was what she was doing, making his sentences say what he clearly meant them to say rather than what they actually said, and handed it back. He read it, turned red, and said that was exactly right and thank you, Miss Keller. She said, "Abigail. Call me Abigail." He nodded and went off looking like a man who had survived something he had not expected to survive. Ira, she learned from Pete during a long afternoon when the older man was helping her drive stakes along the traverse line, had grown up in the territory. His father had ranched near Las Cruces. Ira had come north to Ridgecross in 1871, bought the original Copper Ridge land with money he had made driving cattle up the good night-loving trail, and spent the next 5 years building it up. He had married a woman named Clara in 1874. She had been, Pete said with simple care, a good woman and a good match for Ira. Smart. Funny. She died of a fever in 1879 and took with her the child she had been carrying, and after that Ira had been different. Not broken, Pete said, just quieted. He used to laugh, Pete said, tapping a stake into position with the flat of his hand. Back when Clara was alive, this place was loud with it. Now, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Abigail thought about that for the rest of the afternoon while she took her angles and booked her numbers and told herself it was simply professional context she was gathering about a client. By the end of the second week, she had completed the field traverse. The survey was clean and decisive. She had found all 4 corners of the original patent, established new permanent monuments at each one, and documented the creek shift with measurements precise enough to show exactly how much land Hadley's fence had encroached upon. The answer was 412 acres. 412 acres of Copper Ridge grazing land that Ira Weston had been effectively locked out of for 2 years. She came to supper on the last day of her field work in a state of quiet satisfaction, which was what she felt at the end of good work. The table was full. Pete was telling a story about a bull he had once seen in Chihuahua that was allegedly larger than a freight wagon, which everyone at the table doubted loudly. Denny was laughing. The Reese brothers were eating with their customary focused efficiency. Abigail sat down across from Ira. She took her plate and listened to Pete's story, which grew more elaborate with each sentence, the bull acquiring increasingly impossible attributes. And after a moment she looked at Pete and said, in the perfectly even tone she used when she was being precisely, deliberately deadpan, "Pete, I have been to Chihuahua. The bulls there are large, I will grant you that, but I believe what you saw was probably a very confident mule." The table went silent for exactly 1/2 of a second. And then Ira Weston laughed. It was not possible to describe afterward the quality of the silence that had preceded it or the way the laugh changed the room. The hands all stared. Old Pete, who had known Ira for 15 years, had an expression on his face that Abigail could only describe as stunned. Denny's mouth was open. The Reese brothers exchanged a glance of pure bewilderment, and Ira's face was transformed by it. The hard lines of it did not disappear, but something under them came up to the surface, something warm and real that the grief had been covering, and he was not just laughing at the joke. He was laughing in the way a man laughs when something has broken through a wall he had forgotten was there. He could not stop. He tried to, Abigail could see him trying, and it kept coming back, and the trying and the failing to stop made it funnier to him, which made it worse. Pete was laughing now too, more with relief than humor. Denny was grinning from ear to ear. Even the Reese brothers had the corners of their mouths up. Abigail sat very still and felt something happening inside her that she had absolutely not come to Copper Ridge to feel. She was a professional. She was here to complete a survey. She was not here to notice the way Ira Weston's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, or the way it made him look suddenly and catastrophically younger, or the way her chest had gone tight with something that was not professional satisfaction at all. She looked down at her plate. She was in serious trouble. She spent the following week drafting the plat at the kitchen table, which Ira had offered when it became clear that the bunkhouse, while adequate for sleeping, did not have enough flat surface or good enough light for precision drafting work. She set up her drawing board and her drafting instruments in the early mornings before the household was fully awake, and she worked through the daylight hours on the mathematical reductions, the bearing calculations, the careful ink work on the linen drafting paper that would produce the finished plat. Ira moved around the kitchen in the mornings without disturbing her work. He cooked breakfast, which he did with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, And at some point a plate always appeared at the corner of the table that was not occupied by her drawing board. She ate without looking up from her calculations. He went out to the ranch and she drafted. On the third drafting morning he came in for midday dinner and found her sitting back from the table with a particular expression on her face that she was aware was not a good one. He set a plate in front of her and looked at the draft. "What is wrong?" he said. "I have been running the closure on this traverse for an hour and a half," she said. "The error is 8/100ths of a foot in a traverse of 2 miles. That is inside acceptable standards. But I know where it is, and I know it came from a measurement I had to take at an oblique angle because your eastern fence line comes within 6 feet of the actual boundary, and I could not set up properly." He sat down across from her. "So what does that mean?" he said. "It means the survey is legally sufficient," she said. "But it means that in the northeast corner, the one that Hadley's fence crosses closest, my closure is not as tight as I want it." She paused. "I want to go back and remeasure that section," she said. "I want to do it right." He looked at her for a long moment. "The survey is already within the legal standard," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you want to do it again." "Yes," she said. He picked up his fork. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "You are not going to argue with me about the time or the cost. The cost was settled when you arrived," he said, "and you are the surveyor. I hired you because I understood you knew what you were doing. I am not going to argue about whether you know what you are doing." Abigail was not a woman who showed things easily on her face. She had trained that expressiveness out of herself years ago in the process of working in a profession that did not entirely accept her, and therefore offered her nothing if she showed any uncertainty. But something must have moved across her face in that moment, because Ira looked at her with the same careful attention he gave everything and said, simply, "Nobody is going to challenge this survey in court because of 8/100ths of a foot. But if you need it to be better, go make it better." She went out the next morning with her transit and she remeasured the northeast section. It took 4 hours. When she ran the closure again that evening, the error was 3/100ths of a foot. She sat back and looked at it and felt the satisfaction settle in her chest, clean and complete. She did not tell Ira about the result until supper. She said it casually, in passing, and he nodded and said, "Good." Nothing more than that. She thought about that nod for longer than was reasonable. On the evening of the 15th day, she brought the completed plat to the table. She had produced a document she was proud of, drawn with the precision and clarity that she held herself to, every line exact, every bearing and distance labeled in her best drafting hand, every monument described with the kind of specificity that left no room for legal ambiguity. She laid it on the kitchen table and stepped back. Ira stood over it for a long time without speaking. He moved a lamp closer. He read the legal description she had printed on the right side of the sheet. He looked at the northeast corner detail she had drawn at an enlarged scale on the lower left. He traced the boundary line with his finger without touching the ink. Then he looked up at her. "This is excellent work," he said. Those were simple words. She had heard similar things from clients before, but he said them in a way that was different from how men usually said those things to her, without the faint overlay of surprise that generally accompanied professional praise in her direction. He simply meant it as a fact. "Thank you," she said. He straightened. "I will take this to the land office in Santa Fe next week." He paused. "Will you come with me to present it?" She looked at him. "Surveyors do not generally accompany their clients to file." "I know," he said. "But Hadley will challenge it, and when he does, I would rather have you there to answer technical questions than have to send for you later." He paused again. "I will pay for your time." She thought about her $4.30 and the mule outside and the debt in Santa Fe that was still not fully paid. "All right," she said. The ride to Santa Fe was 4 days. They took the wagon rather than horseback because Ira was bringing other business to the territorial offices, and Abigail sat on the wagon seat beside him and watched the November landscape of New Mexico territory move past and told herself she was not noticing the warmth of his arm when the wagon wheel dropped into a rut, and they knocked together. or the way he handled the team with the same absent, confident competence he brought to everything physical. They talked more on that journey than they had in the previous 2 weeks combined. She found this surprising, and then found that she was not really surprised at all. Away from the ranch, from the structure of the work and the presence of the hands, something loosened in both of them. He asked about the survey license and how she had obtained it, and she told him truthfully, beginning with her father and the education in mathematics and ending with the territorial office in Santa Fe, and the examiner who had given her 3 times the usual number of questions, apparently hoping she would fail. She had not failed. He asked about the business with Briggs. She had not intended to tell him the whole of it, but she found herself doing so anyway, the partnership and the trust and the betrayal and the debt. She did not present it as a tragedy or ask for sympathy. She presented it as a set of facts about her current professional situation that were relevant context. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he said, "Briggs sounds like a man who will do the same thing again to someone else." "Yes," she said. "He probably already has." The anger in his voice, she noticed, was not for himself. He had no stake in Calhoun Briggs. The anger was on her behalf, and it was quiet and certain, and it made something turn over slowly in her chest. She asked him about the ranch. She asked about the cattle operation, the grazing patterns, the water situation in dry years, the relationship with the other ranchers in the area. He answered all of it with the same careful specificity she used herself, and she found that she was genuinely interested in what he said, that the economics and logistics of a cattle operation in the New Mexico Territory in 1882 were not simply polite conversation, but an actual system with its own internal logic that was worth understanding. At some point on the second day, she asked about Clara without planning to. She had been looking at the mountains to the north and thinking about the original survey of this part of the territory, and the men who had done it in the 1850s and 1860s, and the particular courage or recklessness it had required to go into unmapped country with a transit and a chain and a notebook. She had said something about this, about the men who had done the original surveys under conditions that made her own work in a land dispute look comfortable, and Ira had said, in an almost offhand way, that Clara had thought about things like that too, about the people who had come before and what the cost of the land had been to them. She had kept a journal of everything she read about the territory and the people who had been here when the Spanish came in before. There was a silence after he said it. "I am sorry," Abigail said, "about Clara." He did not say it is all right or any of the other things people said in those moments. He said she was a good person. She would have found your work interesting. She had no patience for people who underestimated women. "That is a thing worth saying," Abigail said. He looked at the road ahead. "Yes," he said, "it is." Santa Fe in November of 1882 was cold and bright and full of the particular energy of a territorial capital that had seen too much history and was not done making more. They went first to the Surveyor General's office on the plaza, where Abigail presented the plat and the legal description to the clerk, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew what they would want to see. The clerk was professionally neutral in the face of a woman presenting a survey document, which was more than she sometimes encountered. He took the paperwork and said it would be reviewed and a confirmation sent within 2 weeks. Then they went to the land court offices, where Ira spoke with an attorney he used for territorial matters, a thin, careful man named Alvarado who looked at Abigail's plat with visible admiration and said, in a dry tone, "This is the most thorough boundary survey I have seen on a private land dispute in 10 years. Where did you find her?" "She found me," Ira said. Alvarado asked Abigail 3 technical questions about the northeast corner measurement, and she answered all 3 precisely and in enough detail that he wrote down her answers in his notes. He said, "When Hadley challenges this, and he will, the challenge will not succeed. The survey is unimpeachable." Abigail said nothing to that but sat with it privately for a moment. They stayed 2 nights at a hotel in Santa Fe, separate rooms, and on the second evening they ate supper in the hotel dining room and talked long past the point where the meal was finished. She told him things she had not told anyone in years, not because he asked, but because the way he listened made it natural to say them. About the loneliness of the work, not the physical loneliness of long days alone with her instruments, but the other kind, the loneliness of being competent at something in a world that would rather not acknowledge the competence. About what she wanted, which was to rebuild what Briggs had destroyed and eventually to work at a scale where the surveys she did mattered, county lines and railroad routes, and the things that defined where people could live and how. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Those are good things to want." She looked at him across the hotel dining room table in the lamplight. She had been careful with herself for years, careful and competent and solitary. She said, "What do you want?" She was not entirely certain she meant for the question to be as direct as it came out. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the candle on the table and then at her. "To have the ranch be what it was when Clara was alive," he said. And then he was quiet for another moment, and possibly something more than that. He looked up. "I am not certain yet." They rode back to Ridgecross the following 2 days with a different quality of silence between them than they had ridden out with. Back at Copper Ridge, the work continued, different work now. The legal and administrative follow-up to the survey, writing the formal letter to Hadley's lawyers that cited the specific coordinates and the documentary evidence of the creek shift, drafting the demand for removal of the encroaching fence line. Alvarado was handling the formal legal proceedings, but Abigail found herself still at the kitchen table, still drafting and writing, and Ira found himself still coming in to look at what she was doing and asking questions and sitting across from her. The boundary dispute was no longer the only reason she was at Copper Ridge. Neither of them said this directly for another 2 weeks. Hadley responded to the legal notice by sending 2 large men to ride the fence line along the Copper Ridge eastern boundary, and then to ride past the ranch house and back toward town without stopping, which was a form of communication Abigail recognized as the kind meant to establish that he was not immediately intimidated. Ira saw the men from the barn. He watched them ride past. He came inside and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Abigail and said, "Hadley just sent a message." "I saw," she said. She had been watching from the window. "He will try to discredit the survey first," she said. "He will find someone to claim there is an error in my measurements." "There will not be an error in my measurements, but he will try." "And then what?" Ira said. "And then when that fails, he will try to claim the original patent is void on some procedural basis," she said. "Has Alvarado looked at the original patent document for procedural defects?" "He has it," Ira said. He looked at her. "You have thought about this." "I have been thinking about it since the 3rd day of the field work," she said. "When I understood what Hadley was doing." Ira looked at her for a long moment. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The kitchen was warm with the stove, and outside the December wind was picking up against the windows. He said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "Is there more work here?" he said. "More survey work, I mean. I have parcels along the northern boundary that have not been formally surveyed since the original patent." She thought about the northern boundary. She thought about the debt in Santa Fe and the winter coming and the mule outside and the $4 that was now 30-something more than it had been because of her pay from this contract. "There is always more survey work on a property this size," she said. "If you want the whole patent formally resurveyed, that is probably 3 months of field work in spring when the ground is accessible." He nodded. He said, "I would like to hire you to do it." She said, "Ira." He looked at her. She said, "Are we talking about survey work?" He was still for a moment. The wind pressed against the windows. The lamp on the table put a warm light on the hard planes of his face. "No," he said. "We are not entirely talking about survey work." She put both hands flat on the table. She looked at the drafting paper in front of her and then at him. She was not a woman who hedged. She had never found hedging useful. "I am not an easy person to be with," she said. "I have strong opinions about how things should be done. I work long hours. I will not stop working when I get married. I will not stop working under any circumstances. I have a debt in Santa Fe that is not my fault but is my responsibility to repay. I am not interested in a man who wants a woman who stays in the house." She paused. "I am aware of all of that," he said. "Are you?" she said. "Abigail," he said. "I hired you because the work needed doing and you could do it. I have watched you work for 2 months. I am not the kind of man who falls in love with a woman's willingness to stay in the house." He paused. "I fell in love with the fact that you went back and remeasured that northeast corner." She stared at him. "The closure was 3/100ths of a foot," he said. "I know what that means. That is a person who will not accept less than what is right even when what is right is more than what is required." She was quiet for a long moment. "That is the most unusual declaration I have ever heard," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not a very usual man." She took a breath. She thought about Clara and the journal of history and the good woman Pete had described, and she thought about grief and the wall it built and the supper table and the laugh. She thought about what it had felt like to hear him laugh. She said, "I would like to stay on at Copper Ridge." He nodded. "And I would like," she said more carefully, "to see where this goes, between us, cautiously. Because I am not a person who does things without thinking them through." "Neither am I," he said. The winter at Copper Ridge was the best winter Abigail had experienced since the years before her father died. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, that it would be complicated and awkward, that living in close proximity to a man she was developing feelings for while simultaneously working as his contracted surveyor would produce a state of constant emotional uncertainty. Instead, it was something quieter and stranger and better than that. She and Ira were both people who communicated more effectively through action than through declaration. He came to find her in the field when she was working on the northern boundary preliminary reconnaissance, not to interrupt, but to ask what she was seeing, and to tell her things about the land that were relevant, where the springs were that ran year-round, where the ground became unstable after rain, which sections had been grazed hardest over the years, and were consequently thinner in soil depth. He rode with her sometimes on the longer reconnaissance days, and she taught him to read the landscape through a surveyor's eye, to see the subtle slope differentials and the way water drainage expressed itself in vegetation, and the old blazed witness trees that the original surveyor had marked 60 years before. He listened with the same focused attention he gave everything. He was quick to understand. On the third reconnaissance day, he pointed out a topographic feature she had almost walked past, a nearly invisible drop in grade along what appeared to be a flat section, and said, "That runs to water in spring." She set up her hand level and confirmed that he was correct and looked at him with an expression she could feel was slightly too revealing. "You have a good eye," she said. "I grew up reading this kind of country," he said. "I just never had the words for it before." She recorded the feature in her field book. She noted the elevation difference. Then she looked at him sideways and said, "You would have made a capable surveyor." He looked back at her and said, "I am satisfied with what I am." And then, with the particular restraint that was entirely characteristic of him, "Though the company in the field has improved considerably this fall." She looked at her field book and said nothing, and was entirely certain her face was doing something she could not fully control. Christmas came and went quietly. The territory did not much celebrate it in the Eastern fashion she had grown up with in Massachusetts, and Copper Ridge was not a place of great ceremony. But Mrs. Hoffman in town had sent out a package with Denny when he made the supply run in late December. Fruitcake and dried figs and a small bottle of brandy. And on Christmas evening Ira built the fire higher than usual, and they all sat around the front room, and Pete told stories about Christmases he had seen in the territory going back to before the railroad came. And the story got more elaborate as the brandy went around. And at some point Denny sang a song badly, and the Reese brothers sang one only slightly better, and then Pete sang something in Spanish that was genuinely good. Ira, sitting in the chair nearest the fire with his long legs stretched out, looked at Abigail across the room. She was sitting on the bench along the wall with a cup of brandy-warm cider she had made herself from the dried apples in the root cellar, and she met his look with the direct, steady gaze she gave most things. He did not look away. For once, in the warmth of the fire and the noise of the room, there was something entirely open in his face. She felt it in her chest like a match struck in a cold room. In January, Hadley moved. He did not challenge the survey, which was the move Abigail had predicted and prepared for. Instead, he filed a water rights claim on the creek, arguing that because the creek had been running through what he claimed was his land for the past 2 years, he had established beneficial use, and therefore prior rights to the water for his cattle. Alvarado sent the letter from Santa Fe on a bitter Tuesday morning, when the temperature had dropped into the single figures overnight, and the horses were throwing clouds of breath in the barn. Ira read it at the kitchen table. He handed it to Abigail without comment. She read it. She set it down. She said, "This is clever. He found someone clever to advise him. Can he win this?" Ira said. "On the water claim itself," she said, "probably not, because the creek is on your land and the beneficial use argument fails once the boundary is established. But he can delay. A water rights claim can take 2 years to fully adjudicate in territorial court." She looked at the letter again. "But there is a faster way," she said. He looked at her. "There is a federal statute on navigable waterways," she said, "and a territorial ordinance on seasonal water courses. If this creek is shown to be a seasonal tributary of the Rio Puco, then it falls under federal jurisdiction rather than territorial, and Hadley's claim collapses immediately because federal water law does not recognize beneficial use established through trespass." "Is this creek a tributary of the Rio Puco?" Ira said. She looked at the topographic notes she had been building since October. She thought about the spring she had found on the northern reconnaissance and the drainage pattern it implied. "I need to run a drainage survey," she said. He watched her. "In January," she said. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Rope, stakes, a good horse, and 3 days." He said, "Take your pick from the stable." She ran the drainage survey in 3 days across ground that was sometimes so cold the metal of her transit felt like it would take the skin off her fingers when she handled the bare aluminum. She was systematic and thorough, and occasionally very cold. On the second day, Ira appeared at her field location with a horse carrying saddlebags, and extracted from them a flask of hot coffee and a folded canvas that he attached to 2 survey stakes she had already set to create a windbreak. He set it up without asking if she wanted it, looked at her over his shoulder and said, "You are blue around the mouth," and handed her the coffee. She stood behind the windbreak and held the flask and felt warmth move through her. She had not been taken care of in a long time, not since her father. She had taken care of herself, competently and without complaint, because there had been no alternative. But standing behind a canvas windbreak in January in New Mexico territory with hot coffee in her hands, and Ira Weston holding her transit case out of the wind, she found that being taken care of did not feel like weakness the way she had sometimes feared it might. It felt like being believed in. She found the drainage connection on the 3rd day. The creek was unambiguously a seasonal tributary of the Rio Puco via an intermediate drainage that connected through a narrow valley to the north. She had the measurements to prove it and the topographic context to support it. She came in from the field on the 3rd afternoon and drafted the drainage survey while her boots dried by the stove, and she wrote the technical memorandum for Alvarado in her best legal description prose, precise and definitive. Alvarado filed the federal jurisdiction argument in February. By mid-March, Hadley's water claim had been dismissed. In April, the boundary survey was formally confirmed by the Territorial Land Office. In May, the order for Hadley to remove his encroaching fence line from Copper Ridge land was issued by the Territorial Court. Fletcher Hadley was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, but he was a man who ultimately obeyed court orders rather than risk the more serious legal consequences of defiance. In the last week of May, his fence came down. 412 acres of Copper Ridge grazing land were returned to the man who had always legally owned them. Ira rode the eastern boundary the day after the fence came down. He went alone in the early morning and came back at midday. He came into the kitchen where Abigail was at the table with her field notes for the spring survey work, and he stood in the doorway for a moment. "Well," he said. She looked up. "It is done," he said. She said, "I know." He came inside and pulled out the chair across from her. He sat down. He looked at the table for a moment and then at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. He had said that before, she remembered. In December at the kitchen table with the wind on the windows. "I have a proposal," he said. His voice was steady and level, but there was something underneath it that was not entirely level. She waited. "Marry me," he said. He said it simply, without ornamentation or elaborate preamble, which was entirely characteristic of him. "And stay here. Work on the ranch as long as there is work to be done, which I suspect will be always, because the territorial land situation is not going to simplify itself. Bring your instruments and your field books and your extraordinary stubbornness about closure errors. Help me build this place back to what it was." He paused. "I know what I am asking you to give up," he said. "I know you had plans for the business in Santa Fe. I am not asking you to give them up. The offer is not conditional, but I want you here." She looked at him. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it for months in the careful, systematic way she thought about everything important, running the traverse in her mind, closing the loop, checking the error. The calculation she had arrived at was not complicated. The debt in Santa Fe was nearly paid. She had 4 more months of survey work under contract with Ira, and 3 referrals that had come in during the winter from other ranch owners in the area, who had heard about the Hadley case through Alvarado and wanted surveys done on their own boundary questions. Her professional reputation in the Southern Territory was, for the first time since Briggs had tried to destroy it, actually growing. And here at Copper Ridge, in the kitchen she had been working in for 7 months, with the man across the table who had given her a windbreak in a January field and listened to her talk about survey closures as if the numbers mattered to him too, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt like herself, completely and without apology. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "My answer is yes, Ira." He reached across the table and took her hand. His hands were large and calloused and warm. He held hers for a moment as if he was not entirely certain what to do next with the fact that she had said yes. Then she said, "I need to get the northern traverse finished before the summer heat sets in, so the wedding should be soon." He looked at her and the ghost of that laugh, the one from the supper table in October, moved across his face. "You are thinking about the survey," he said. "I'm always thinking about the survey," she said. "I'm also saying yes. Both things are true simultaneously." He held her hand a moment longer. Then he said, 2 weeks. She looked at him. "The wedding," he said. 2 weeks is enough time to get the territorial clerk out here and send word to town." She nodded. She said, 2 weeks. He let go of her hand and stood up. He went to the stove and she heard him putting on the coffee. She looked back down at her field notes and did not try to control whatever was on her face. The wedding at Copper Ridge happened on a clear Saturday morning in early June of 1883. The territorial clerk came out from Ridgecross with his registration ledger and his official stamp. Mrs. Hoffman came, bringing food and a general air of pleased vindication that Abigail found she liked very much. Alvarado rode up from Santa Fe, which Abigail had not expected. The ranch hands were all present. Pete Garza wore his best shirt and stood close to the right side of the ceremony with an expression of profoundly contained emotion. Abigail wore the dress she had brought from Santa Fe, dark blue wool, not a wedding dress in the traditional sense, but a dress she had bought with her own money, and that fit her well, and that she chose to wear on this occasion because she liked it. She carried no flowers because she had not thought of it until that morning, and by then the point was moot, and also because she was not certain flowers added much to the legal validity of a territorial marriage registration. She said "I do" in a clear, level voice. Ira said it too. He was looking at her when he said it, directly and without ceremony, and the gray-green eyes had in them the same quality she had seen on Christmas evening by the fire, entirely open. The clerk stamped the ledger. Mrs. Hoffman clapped. Pete may have made a sound that was not entirely unlike a very restrained sob. Denny cheered loudly enough that one of the horses in the barn shifted and snorted. They ate Mrs. Hoffman's food at the long outdoor table, and it was a good afternoon. Alvarado made a brief speech that was dry and warm in equal measure. Ira did not make a speech. He sat beside Abigail at the table, and once, in the middle of a conversation she was having with Mrs. Hoffman about the land office procedures, he reached over and put his hand over hers on the table, just briefly, and then went back to his food. She kept talking to Mrs. Hoffman and felt the warmth of his hand for the rest of the afternoon. The spring survey of the northern boundary took 3 months and was the most comprehensive survey work Abigail had done since she arrived in the territory. She was in the field most days by first light, returning at noon for dinner and going back out until the light failed. The northern land was rougher than the eastern sections, more varied in topography, and more interesting to her. She found 2 springs that were not on any existing map. She found the remains of what appeared to be a very old wall, possibly pre-Spanish occupation, that she documented carefully in her field book, and mentioned in her surveyor's notes with a flag that the territorial historical surveyor might want to investigate. Ira came with her sometimes. He was getting better at reading the transit measurements, not skilled enough to take them himself, but competent enough to hold the rod steady at the backside while she took the angles, which helped considerably with the longer traverses. He was also better than she was at reading the large-scale terrain, the water and weather patterns, and she found herself relying on his knowledge of the land in the same way she relied on her instruments, as a different kind of measurement tool. They did not talk constantly in the field. They were both people comfortable with silence, but the silences were full of a different quality than the early silences between them. She would be at the transit taking an angle and she would hear him behind her looking at the country, and she would know, without needing to check, that he was content. It was a recognition she had not had with anyone before, this quiet certainty of another person's state of mind. By July she was certain she was pregnant. She did not say anything for 2 weeks while she confirmed it with the additional certainty that her body's patterns always gave her. She was systematic about everything. When she was fully certain she told Ira at supper, directly and without elaborate preamble, which was also characteristic of her. He was still for a moment. The table was just the 2 of them that evening, the hands having eaten earlier. He looked at her. He had an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was not quite composed. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I feel fine. I intend to keep working through the fall at minimum. The survey needs to be finished before the ground freezes." He nodded. There was a pause, and then something came into his face that she recognized, something raw and real and very old. She said, "Ira." He said the last time. She knew what he meant. "Clara, I know," she said. She put her hand on the table between them. He covered her hand with his. He looked at the table. He was quiet for a long time. She said, "I am not going to tell you it will be different. I cannot know that. What I can tell you is that I am healthy and the ranch is closer to Ridgecross than many places, and there is a good doctor in Santa Fe if we need one, and I will be sensible about the field work." He looked up. She said, "I need you to tell me what you need from me. Right now, not in general, specifically." He thought about that. He said, "I need you to promise me you will tell me if anything feels wrong. Not wait, not assess it first. Just tell me. That is a reasonable request," she said. She paused. "I need you to not look at me the way you are looking at me right now, every day for the next 8 months, she said, "because I cannot work under that level of surveillance." Something moved in his face, not quite the laugh, a younger version of it. He said, "I will try." She said, "That is all I can ask." He kept holding her hand. The fall came and she was still in the field most mornings, though she had adjusted the nature of the work. She was not setting up the transit on steep slopes anymore. She was drafting, processing, writing the legal descriptions and the final plat for the Northern Survey. She worked at the kitchen table with the window open to the October air and the sound of the ranch outside, and she felt more settled in her life than she could remember feeling since she was a girl in her father's workshop, learning the names of angles. The debt in Santa Fe was fully paid in October. She had received the final payment from a county surveying contract that had come through Alvarado's referral, a boundary survey for a new county road commission that was exactly the scale of work she had always wanted to do. She paid the last of Calhoun Briggs's damage off, and she sat with the receipt from the Santa Fe bank in her hand, and she felt something release in her chest that she had not realized she was still holding. She told Ira that evening. He said, "Good." He said it with a quiet satisfaction that was not about money, and she knew he understood what it meant. The baby was born in February of 1884 on a cold, clear night when the stars were so sharp over the ridge that they looked like something cut out of black paper. They had brought a doctor from Santa Fe to Ridgecross 2 weeks before, a competent woman named Dr. Mercer, who had set up a small practice in the town, and who understood that Abigail did not want to be managed, but did want to be assisted by someone who knew what they were doing. It was a boy. He was large and loud and entirely healthy, and he arrived at approximately 3 in the morning, while Ira sat in the kitchen with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and Pete sat outside on the porch because he said he needed the air. And when Dr. Mercer came to the kitchen door and said it was done and everyone was fine, Ira was on his feet before she finished the sentence. They named the boy Samuel, which had been Abigail's father's name. Ira held Samuel in the early morning light with an expression on his face that she would not attempt to put into words. He held him very carefully, the way he handled fragile things, with enormous attention and restraint, and the baby made a small disorganized sound and grabbed at the air, and Ira put his little finger into the reaching hand and Samuel grabbed it. Abigail lay in the bed with her hair loose and her body exhausted in a way that was entirely different from any physical exhaustion she had experienced in the field, and she watched her husband hold their son, and she understood several things simultaneously. She understood that grief did not leave. She understood that what happened instead, if you were very fortunate, was that life grew up around it and through it, and eventually grief was no longer the only thing in a space, just one of the things, alongside what was new and present and real. She understood that Ira Weston was holding Samuel with the love he had for Clara's child too, for the child that had not got to be born, and that this did not diminish what Samuel was to him, it deepened it. She said his name. He looked at her. She said, "Come sit with me." He came and sat on the edge of the bed with Samuel still in his hands, and she reached up and touched the side of his face, the weathered jaw and the gray at his temples, and he turned into her hand the way a man turns toward warmth. He said, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He looked down at Samuel and back at her. He said, "For coming into the yard that October with your instrument case and your $4 and your absolute certainty about what you could do." She said, "The certainty was justified." He said, "I know, that was what I meant." She put her arm down and he settled beside her, and they sat in the early morning light with Samuel between them, and outside, the stars were fading over Copper Ridge, and the cattle were moving in the pasture, and the world was doing what it always did, which was continuing. Abigail went back to the field in May. She took a contract in June for the railroad survey she had been hoping for since she arrived in the territory. A preliminary reconnaissance for a branch line, the Denver and Rio Grande Western, was considering routing through the southern New Mexico mountains. It was the largest professional contract she had ever held, 3 months of field work with a crew of 6, and it would be done 50 miles from Copper Ridge. She and Ira talked about it at the kitchen table for an entire evening. She said, "I want to do this work." He said, "I know." She said, "It means being away from the ranch for parts of the summer." He said, "Samuel will be here. I will be here. Pete is as good as a second parent to that boy already." He looked at her. "This is what you said you wanted to do when you arrived." She said, "You heard me." He said, "I have been listening since October." She left for the railroad survey in late June, riding out on the wagon with her transit and her field books and the new equipment she had purchased with the advance on the railroad contract, a better plane table and a first-rate telescope rod. She turned on the seat as the wagon reached the ridge above the ranch and looked back. Ira was standing in the yard with Samuel in his arms. Samuel was 7 months old and had recently developed opinions about everything and was currently occupied with trying to put Ira's collar button in his mouth. Ira was not paying attention to the collar button because he was watching the wagon. She raised her hand. He raised his free hand. She turned back to the road and felt herself smiling in the way she sometimes smiled alone in the field when the closure came out tight and everything was exactly where it should be. The railroad survey was the hardest and best work of her professional life. The terrain in the southern mountains was extraordinary, steep and variable and geologically complex in ways that made conventional survey methods slow, and required her to think laterally and carefully, and often to reapproach a problem from an angle she had not originally considered. The crew she led was mixed in their initial response to a woman running the operation, predictably, but she had been dealing with that response for 8 years, and she knew, from experience, that what changed minds was competence demonstrated without apology. By the end of the first week, the most skeptical of the crew members, a Nevada-trained instrument man named Hobbs, was asking her technical questions with genuine interest. She wrote to Ira every week. She wrote in the same direct way she talked, describing the terrain and the survey problems and the specific solutions she had found, because she knew he would understand and be interested. He wrote back. His letters were shorter than hers, but they were precise in the way his conversation was precise. He told her about Samuel's progress. He told her about the eastern pasture and the new calf numbers. He told her, in one letter, that Pete had taught Samuel to clap his hands and then had been insufferably proud about it for a full week. In September, she came home. She came down the road toward Copper Ridge in the early afternoon, the equipment wagon ahead of her and her own horse under her, and she saw Ira in the yard before she reached the gate. He had been working at the fence nearest the house, and he straightened when he saw the wagon coming, and for a moment he just stood there watching. She rode through the gate and dismounted. He came across the yard. He was not a man who did things for show, and he did not now. He just covered the distance between them, and then he was there, solid and certain and warm, and his arms were around her, and she was home. She said into his shoulder, "Samuel." He said, "Asleep." He said it against her hair. She leaned back and looked at him. He was the same as he had been when she left, which was reassuring because she had had an unreasonable concern that something would have changed in 3 months, and it had not. The gray-green eyes and the weathered face and the jaw she had come to know as well as any topographic feature in her surveys, the high point and the hollows and the long line of it. "You look thinner," he said. "3 months of trail cooking," she said. "Do not take it personally." He put his hand along her face in the same way she had put her hand on his on the night Samuel was born, and she thought, not for the first time, that they were well matched in the ways that counted. Samuel woke from his nap in the late afternoon, and the reunion was loud and physical and entirely successful. He was 10 months old and had learned to pull himself upright against the furniture, and he regarded his mother with the particular severe assessment of a person who was not entirely certain where she had been and had opinions about it. And then he reached for her and she picked him up and he grabbed her braid with both hands and pulled. "Ow," she said. Ira, leaning in the doorway, was smiling. She looked at him over Samuel's head. He said, "He has been doing that since July." She said, "This is deliberate." "He is very intelligent," Ira said, with entirely inappropriate satisfaction. She looked at Samuel, who looked back at her with Ira's eyes, gray-green and watchful and entirely certain of himself. She said, "God help us both." The railroad contract, when the survey was filed, led to a formal appointment that arrived from the Denver and Rio Grande Western in November of 1884, a retainer to serve as consulting surveyor for the proposed Southern Branch Line construction. It was a significant professional appointment, one of the first of its kind extended to a woman in the New Mexico territory, and the letter from the railroad's chief engineer was careful and precise and entirely respectful of her qualifications. She told Ira at supper. He read the letter. He read it again. He set it on the table and looked at her. "Well," he said. She waited. He said, "I am very proud of you, Abigail." He said it simply and directly, the way he said the things that mattered. She said, "The work will be complicated. The construction phase will require ongoing surveys throughout 1885. I may be away more than I would like." He said, "I know." She said, "I have been thinking about hiring a survey assistant, someone I can train. I would need to pay them, which means I would need to draw more from the contract rather than putting it into the ranch fund." He said, "The ranch fund is fine. Pay your assistant." She said, "You are not going to argue with me about any of this." He said, "Abigail, when have I ever argued with you about your work?" She thought about it. She said, "Never." He nodded as if this was a settled matter. She said, "You are an unusual man." He said, "You have said that before." She said, "I keep confirming it." He looked at her across the table. Samuel was in the corner of the room in the low wooden crib that Ira had built asleep, making the small sounds that Samuel made when he was deeply under. The fire was high. It was November and the temperatures had come down and Copper Ridge was warm and solid against the cold outside. He said, "I am happy." She looked at him. He said, "I need you to know that. I know I do not say it in so many words, but I am. More than I expected to be again." She said, "Ira." He said, "I laughed at supper a year ago this month. Do you remember?" She said, "I remember." He said, "I had not laughed like that in 3 years. Do you know what it felt like?" She waited. He said, "Like something remembered, like something I had forgotten I was allowed to do." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You made a very confident mule very funny." He said, "You made me." She looked at him. She said, "I was being honest about Chihuahua." He said, "I know, that was the point." She thought about the supper table and the frozen hands and the $4 and the 7-mile mule ride from Ridgecross on an October morning, and all the things that had happened after. She said, "I did not come to Copper Ridge to make you laugh." He said, "I know that too." She said, "But I am glad it happened." He said, "So am I." He came around the table and sat beside her, and they were quiet for a while in the warm kitchen with Samuel sleeping, and the fire burning and the cold November outside. And she leaned against his shoulder because she wanted to and because she could. By the spring of 1885, the railroad work was fully underway, and Abigail had hired her survey assistant, a young Mexican-American woman from Las Cruces named Rosa Gutierrez, who had a sharp eye for angles and a gift for mathematics, and who had been, until Abigail hired her, working as a seamstress because no one had offered her anything better. Rosa learned quickly and well, and within 3 months was operating the transit with a precision that made Abigail actively pleased. Samuel walked for the first time in March of 1885, which Abigail was present for, to her considerable relief, having been at the ranch for the winter drafting season. He walked across the kitchen floor from the table to the cabinet where Ira kept the coffee, which Ira said indicated advanced intelligence, and Abigail said indicated he had been watching Ira for 11 months and had identified priorities. He started talking shortly after that, the first words fractured and determined, and among the first 5 words he produced with any reliability were Mama, Papa, Pete, Cow, and the particular urgent syllable he used for coffee that Abigail found both alarming and predictable. In August of 1885, Abigail filed the last survey document for the railroad branch line survey. It was accepted by the railroad's engineering office in Denver without revision. The chief engineer sent a letter that said the survey work had been exceptional and that the railroad would be happy to provide a letter of professional reference. She brought the letter home to Copper Ridge on a Friday afternoon in late summer, and she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Rosa was working on some drafting in the corner. Samuel, 16 months old and fully mobile and carrying opinions on all subjects, was in the yard with Pete, who had recently become Samuel's primary outdoor companion and held this role with enormous pride. Ira was not yet in from the pasture. She heard his horse come into the yard. She heard him speak to Samuel outside, heard Samuel's enthusiastic and not entirely coherent response, heard Ira's low laugh. She looked at the letter again. She thought about the woman she had been riding into Ridgecross on a mule with a leather instrument case and $4.30, and she thought about the woman she was now, sitting in the kitchen of her own home with a railroad professional reference letter on the table and a toddler in the yard and a business that was real and growing and entirely hers. She was not the same person. She was more of herself than she had been then. That was the only way she could describe it. Ira came in from the yard. He had Samuel on his hip because Samuel had apparently insisted on coming inside with him. He looked at Abigail and then at the letter. She said the railroad accepted the survey without revision. He looked at her. He said, "Rosa." Abigail said, "It was both of us." He came to the table and set Samuel down and picked up the letter and read it. Samuel immediately went for the corner of Abigail's instrument case, which he had been fascinated by since he learned to reach for things, and she scooped him up without looking away from Ira's face. Ira set the letter down. He said, "Exceptional." He said it the way he had said excellent work 2 years ago in the kitchen, just a fact, but a fact he was presenting to her as something to take. She said, "I think we should open the brandy." He looked at her and smiled. Not the full laugh, just the version of it that lived in his eyes, quieter and warmer than the one at the supper table, the one that was specifically hers. He said, "I think that is exactly right." The brandy was good, and the evening was warm, and Rosa stayed for supper because Ira insisted. And Pete came in from the yard claiming Samuel had been conducting important cattle business and needed to be informed of what it was, and the table was loud the way it sometimes was now, the good kind of loud, and at some point, Samuel fell asleep in his chair between bites of cornbread and had to be carried to his crib. Ira came back to the table after. The others had gone. Abigail was still at the table with her brandy, looking at the letter from Denver. He sat down. She said, "I want to tell you something." He waited. She said, "When I rode into Ridgecross 2 years ago, I thought I was coming for a survey contract. I thought I was going to do the work and leave and perhaps rebuild my reputation enough to get the next contract." He was watching her. She said, "I was not looking for this. I was not looking for you or this ranch or any of this." She looked around the kitchen. I had stopped expecting it. I had told myself that the work was enough and that it was better to be clear about that than to want something that was not available to me. He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I think I was wrong about what was available to me. I think I was calculating based on what had been true before, and I was not accounting for the possibility that the variables would change." He said, "You are talking about me as a variable." She said, "You are a significant variable, yes." He said, "I will take it." She said, "What I am trying to say in the least romantic possible way is that I am happy, and I am grateful, not to you specifically. To the fact that I came here and you hired me and then you listened and then you did not try to talk me out of the northeast corner remeasurement." He said, "The northeast corner." She said, "It was the first time I understood that you were not going to be like the others." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The others who underestimated you." She said, "Yes." He said, "I was not uncertain about you after the first day." She said, "You looked at my instrument case like you were not certain it was real." He said, "I was not uncertain about you. I was uncertain about my own reaction to you. Those are different things." She looked at him. She said, "What was your reaction on the first day?" He considered this with the care he gave things that mattered. He said, "She is going to change everything." She held that for a moment. Then she said, "Was I that obvious?" He said, "Not you, me." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand under hers and held it. The fire in the stove had gone low. Outside, the August night in New Mexico territory was warm and clear, and the stars over Copper Ridge were exactly as she had come to know them, the particular pattern of them above the ridge that she had memorized the way she memorized topographic features, as a landmark for orientation. She knew where she was. She knew, with the same certainty she brought to a survey closure run to 0.03 of a foot, exactly where she was. The second child came in the spring of 1887, a daughter they named Clara, which was Abigail's suggestion, and which Ira received with a stillness, and then a nod that told her everything she needed to know about whether it was the right name. Ira Weston arrived in March on a day of high wind and bright sky, and she was loud from the first moment, and had, according to Dr. Mercer, an extraordinarily determined grip for a newborn. Pete, when informed of the name, went outside and spent 20 minutes alone. He came back dry-eyed and said she was a beautiful child, which she was. Samuel, who was 3.5, regarded his sister with the formal caution of a person who has been briefed about a situation and is reserving judgment. He warmed to her over the following weeks at a pace that seemed calibrated to whatever his private assessment told him was appropriate. By summer, he had decided she was acceptable. By fall, he was sharing information with her, with an urgency suggesting he felt she was not learning things fast enough. Abigail in the field less than she had been during the railroad survey years, but still working, still running surveys for the County Road Commission and for private land owners, and occasionally for the territorial government on boundary questions, watched her children grow with the same attention she brought to everything she cared about, specific, interested, and never underestimating. She had not stopped working. She had never intended to stop. Ira had never expected her to. Rosa Gutierrez, who was now a licensed surveyor in her own right through the territorial office, had built a practice of her own in Las Cruces. She sent Abigail a letter when the license came through, and Abigail wrote back a letter that was longer than her usual ones, because she was genuinely pleased in a way that had nothing to do with her own professional interests, and everything to do with having understood, in the training years, that Rosa was going to be better at certain aspects of the work than she was. She told Ira about Rosa's license over supper. He looked at her across the table. Clara was in her lap, 3 months old and entirely focused on the process of existing. Samuel was eating with the systematic intensity he brought to meals, having apparently decided somewhere around age 4 that food was a problem to be solved rather than enjoyed. Ira said, "You are proud of her." Abigail said, "I am. She did something I could not do at her age. I did not have anyone who would hire me without my father's name attached to mine. Rosa had that from the start, and she made more of it than I could have." He said, "You gave her that." She said, "I opened a door." What she did with it was entirely her own. He looked at her. The gray-green eyes were warm and knowing. He said, "Someone opened a door for you once too." She thought about her father and the mathematics and the instruments in the Santa Fe workshop. She said, "Yes." He said, "And look what you did with it." She said, "Ira." She said it with the particular tone she used when he said something that she wanted to receive without deflecting, which was harder than most things. He passed her the cornbread. She took a piece. Samuel looked up from his plate and said, "Is it good?" in the serious tone he used for important questions. She said, "It is very good." He went back to eating. Clara grabbed her braid. Ira watched all of this and said nothing, and had on his face the look he sometimes had that she had come to understand meant he was counting his blessings and did not want to disturb them by speaking. In the early summer of 1889, the New Mexico Territory was in full political motion toward statehood, which was still several years off, but generating enormous activity in the land offices and the survey records, and the legal establishment of boundaries that would become state boundaries, rather than territorial ones. Abigail was hired as one of 3 consulting surveyors to assist the territorial government in reviewing and correcting the existing land records in the southern counties. It was the most significant appointment of her career. It was also, as she explained to Ira in careful detail, going to require a great deal of time and some travel for the next 2 or 3 years. He said, "Do it." She said, "Samuel is 6 and Clara is 2. He said they will be here. I will be here. Pete will outlive all of us, and he regards those children as his personal project. Do the work, Abigail. She looked at him. She was 41 years old. She was at the peak of her professional abilities, and she knew it. The kind of competence that only comes from years of accumulated judgment. The ability to see problems in 3 dimensions at once, and to know what mattered and what was noise. She said, when I ride into the territorial office in Santa Fe, I will be the most senior surveyor in the room. He said, yes. She said, there will be men there who have been licensed for 20 years who will look at me and assume otherwise. He said, until you open your mouth. She said, yes. Until then. He said, will that be enough? He said it seriously, asking whether she was all right with that, not doubting her ability to handle it. She thought about it. She said, it is irritating and it is unjust, and I will never entirely stop being angry about it. But it has not yet been sufficient reason to stop working. She paused. So yes, it will be enough. He said, then go to Santa Fe and be the most senior surveyor in the room. She went. The Territorial Survey Commission work took 2.5 years, and it was the most challenging and intellectually engaging work of her career. She was in Santa Fe for weeks at a time, traveling back to Copper Ridge between sessions. The children grew in those absences in the way children did, in leaps that surprised her each time. Samuel at 7 was reading fluently, and had developed a precise interest in the mathematics of cattle counting that Ira said was entirely practical, and Pete said was slightly alarming. Clara at 3 was loud and specific, and had opinions about everything, and a laugh that was exactly like Ira's supper table laugh, sudden and complete. Abigail came home from a month in Santa Fe in October of 1889 to find Clara waiting at the gate with Pete, who had apparently received advance notice of the arrival via some communication system of his own, and Clara ran across the yard at speed and was picked up and held and said, "Mama was gone a long time," in the tone of a judge reading a verdict. Abigail said, "I know. I'm home now." Clara said, "Papa made biscuits wrong." Ira, coming from the barn, said, "The biscuits were fine." Clara looked at him with an expression that was purely Abigail's and said, "They were not right." Ira looked at Abigail over Clara's head with an expression that she recognized as the particular exhausted fondness of a man who has been defeated by a 3-year-old for a month and is both worn out by it and entirely charmed. She said quietly, "She is yours, you know." He said, "I know. This is my penance." She put Clara down and walked to him. He put his arms around her. He was the same as always, solid and present and smelling of the ranch and the outdoors. The particular combination of wood smoke and leather and New Mexico air that she had come to understand was what home smelled like. She said into his shoulder, "The commission work is going well." He said, "I know. I read your letters." She said, "I am going to be finished by spring." He said, "Good. Then you can come home and correct Clara's assessment of the biscuits." She said, "I am not going to do that." He said, "I know." She leaned back and looked at him. He looked back at her. The same gray-green eyes she had met across a kitchen table the first October morning, the same face, more time on it now, but the same fundamental structure underneath. She said, "I love you." He said, "I know that too." He was looking at her with everything in his face that he usually kept contained, the whole of it out at once, the way it only came to the surface completely when they were alone or when he was looking at the children. He said, "I love you, Abigail." She nodded. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder again, and then straightened because Clara had come back and was demanding someone adjudicate a dispute with Samuel about whether the cat was allowed inside. The years that followed were the full years. Abigail completed the Territorial Commission work in the spring of 1890 and submitted the final survey review report to the territorial government in April. It was accepted and entered into the public record, and the chief territorial surveyor sent a letter of commendation that she framed and put on the wall of the office she had established by then in a small separate building at Copper Ridge, her drafting room and instrument room, built by Ira and Pete, the previous fall with enough north-facing windows to give her the right light for drafting work. Her professional practice continued. It was different in the 1890s than it had been in the 1880s, more established and more selective. She could now choose the contracts she took rather than taking everything offered, and she chose work that interested her and that she thought mattered. County boundary work, township surveys, the occasional complex private dispute that required the kind of deep historical research she had become particularly good at. Rosa Gutierrez, now running the most respected survey practice in southern New Mexico, sent referrals when cases were beyond her geographic range. They corresponded regularly and met in Santa Fe 2 or 3 times a year, and the meetings were always full of technical conversation and genuine friendship. Ira expanded the ranch's northern pastures after the boundary work was completed, and Copper Ridge became, through the early 1890s, one of the more productive cattle operations in the county. He was not a man who expanded for expansion's sake, but a man who grew carefully and maintained what he built, and the ranch reflected this, solid and well-run, and not over-leveraged in the way many operations were in the lean years that came in the mid-1890s. Samuel grew up knowing the ranch and knowing the survey instruments and being asked, from the time he was old enough to understand it, what he thought about problems. He was 17 in 1897, quiet and careful in the way his father was, and he had decided, with characteristic methodical certainty, that he wanted to go to the School of Mines in Socorro to study engineering. Abigail read his letter of application before he sent it and made 12 specific suggestions about how to strengthen it. He made 11 of the 12 changes. She asked about the 12th, and he said he thought his phrasing was clearer than hers on that one point. She read both versions again and conceded he was correct. He was accepted. Ira watched him ride away toward Socorro on a September morning in 1897 and said nothing for a while and then said, "He will be all right." Abigail said, "He will be more than all right." He said, "I know, he is still your son," she said. He said, "Yes." She put her hand in his, he held it. Clara at 10 was doing mathematics at a level that Abigail was watching with professional interest and personal delight. She had her grandmother's name and her father's laughter, and her mother's absolute refusal to accept imprecise reasoning about anything. She had also recently developed an interest in astronomy that had led to a correspondence with the observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, which was new and active and willing, apparently, to respond to letters from 10-year-old girls in New Mexico asking detailed questions about transit observations for stellar position. Abigail found the correspondence in Clara's room one afternoon, a stack of letters organized by date, and read enough to understand what was happening, which was that her daughter was learning celestial navigation methods from a professional astronomer who had identified in her letters a mathematical mind worth encouraging. She put the letters back and went to find Ira. She said, "Your daughter has been corresponding with an observatory." He said, "Which one?" She said, "Flagstaff." "She has been learning how to determine stellar positions from transit observations." He looked at her. He said, "She is 10. She said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where does she get that from?" She looked at him. She said, "Think about it." He thought about it. He looked at her. He said, "Right." She said, "We should get her a better telescope." He said, "I was going to say exactly that." The telescope came from a scientific instrument dealer in Denver, ordered by mail in the fall of 1897, and arrived in November. And Clara received it on her 11th birthday with an expression of total, speechless joy that lasted approximately 40 seconds before she began asking technical questions about the mount. That evening, Abigail sat at her drafting table in the survey office and looked out the north window at the stars over Copper Ridge and thought about the way the years arranged themselves in a traverse, each point leading to the next, each angle and distance booked and processed and contributing to the final picture. She thought about the October morning she had ridden in on the mule. She thought about the survey she had run on frozen ground in January, and the windbreak in the field, and the supper table and the laugh. She thought about all the points in between, the Platte and the Santa Fe Hotel and the Christmas brandy and the river drainage, and the morning Samuel was born, and the railroad survey and Rose's license, and the commission work, and the years that had built themselves one on top of the other into something that was, by any rational measurement, more than she had been calculating for when she was a woman of 26 with $4 in her pocket and a professional reputation in ruins. She heard Ira's step on the porch of the survey office. The door opened. He came in with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the edge of the drafting board, careful of the current work, which was a township boundary question she was reviewing for the county. He sat in the chair she kept for clients, a good solid oak chair, and wrapped his hands around his own cup. He said, "Clara has already moved the telescope twice to find better angles. She said she is going to be better at this than I am." He said, "At surveying or astronomy." She said, "Both. Possibly everything." He said, "She is certainly better at the biscuits than I am." Abigail said, "Everyone is better at the biscuits than you are." He said, "That is a fair assessment." She turned from the window and looked at him. He was 55, and the gray was all the way through his hair now, and the weathering on his face was deep and certain, and he was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever looked at through any instrument. She said, "Ira." He said, "Yes." She said, "That day at the supper table when you laughed. Do you know I have replayed it in my mind more times than any other single event in my professional career?" He said, "More than the northeast corner remeasurement." She said, "Comparable to the northeast corner remeasurement." He said, "I am not sure whether to be honored by that or slightly concerned." She said, "Be honored. The northeast corner is the finest work I have ever done." He looked at her with those eyes that she had been reading for 14 years and that she was still learning. He said, "And the laugh." She said, "Was the moment I knew I was in trouble." He said, "You did not show it." She said, "I was looking at my plate." He said, "I know. I was looking at you." She said, "You were looking at me." He said, "I have been looking at you since October." She said, "You might have mentioned that at some point before December." He said, "I needed to be certain." She said, "Certain of what?" He said, "That it was real, that I had not invented it because I wanted it to be there." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "It was real." He said, I know that now." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I know what I did not know when Clara was alive, which is that happiness is not a fixed quantity. It does not run out, it grows." He looked at her. "This is larger than anything I had before. It is different, but it is larger." She stood up from the drafting table and crossed the survey office, which was not large, and stood in front of his chair. He looked up at her. She put both hands on his face, the way she sometimes did, and he put his hands over hers. She said, "I am glad you laughed." He said, "You made an extremely good point about the bull." She said, "It was an honest observation." He said, "It always is." She leaned down and kissed him. There in the survey office in November, with the stars coming out over Copper Ridge, and the cold pressing on the windows, and the sound of Clara somewhere in the house asking Ira about declination angles with the focused urgency of someone who needs an answer immediately. He kissed her back. His hands were warm. Inside the house, Clara found that no one was answering her questions and went to find Pete, who was in the kitchen, and who did not know anything about declination angles, but was willing to listen to an explanation of them with complete attention and considerable admiration. Outside, the stars over the ridge were exactly where they had always been, where the measurements said they should be, constant and reliable as a booked angle. And in the survey office at Copper Ridge, Abigail Keller put her forehead against her husband's and breathed, and was where she was supposed to be, which was here in this life, which was hers and his and theirs together, closed and true and fully solved. All the traverses come home.